I was restocking analgesic cartridges on the third shelf when they wheeled David in. That is the honest beginning of it. Not a dramatic entrance. Some moment of destiny pushing me through the sickbay doors. I had a crate of cartridges, a count to finish, and a shift that ended in 40 minutes. David Crail came in on a gurney pushed by two palace runners, his work clothes still on. His hands still black from the docking bays. And when I looked up from my count, I saw that his eyes were open, but they were not tracking anything. That is a specific look. I have seen it in the field, 23 years ago, in places that did not have marble floors or automated light fixtures. You learn what it means. It means the body has gone somewhere the mind cannot easily follow. The palace physicians, three of them, senior staff, robes the color of storm cloud, were already in motion. They moved the way courtiers do when they are performing competence as much as practicing it. They ran their hand wands over him. They spoke to one another in solemn medical terminology I understand, maybe half of, and I will admit the half I understand is adequate. I kept my cartridges in my hands and watched, because that was my job. Watch, stay out of the way, restock what they tell me to restock. The problem announced itself in about 4 minutes. One of the physicians, Telvara, the senior, a man with silver pale skin and markings along his jaw that indicated long service rank in the Imperial Medical Corps, pulled back from the scanner and said quietly that the fragment was too deep to map. There had been a docking accident in Bay 11. A container of stellar debris, unclassified material from the outer fringe collection, had ruptured during decompression. A fragment no larger than a thumbnail had gone into David's left shoulder. The palace scanner could find its mass. It could not read what it was doing to the tissue around it, because the fragment was emitting a low-spectrum resonance that the scanner interpreted as instrument interference. Every reading came back corrupted. Telvara said the word I had learned to dread in sick bays, inconclusive. He said it to the other physicians, not to David, because David was on the table, and his eyes were still open and still not tracking. Then Telvara said the next word I had learned to dread even more. He said the word that means, in the polished language of imperial medicine, stepping back from this patient until we know more. Biohazard protocol, unknown stellar material, unknowable tissue effect. The three of them withdrew behind the containment threshold. An orderly draped a monitoring hood over David and set the room's alarm parameters. Then everyone, more or less, left. I stood there with my cartridges. Here is what I know about humans and about stellar debris and about the outer fringe in that order. I know humans. I know the way a human body speaks when it is frightened and alone, because the body does speak if you know how to listen. I know the outer fringe, not at all. What I know about stellar debris is that, in 23 years of field medicine, I was never once harmed by sitting beside a patient and taking their pulse at the wrist. I set my cartridges down on the shelf. I pulled a stool to the side of the gurney. I sat. I took David's right hand in both of mine, the way my instructor showed me in the second year of my field training, when she said, "Before you run a single instrument, before you run a single protocol, you put your hands on the patient and you listen with your fingers. The pulse at the wrist tells you a great deal. The temperature of the skin tells you more. The way the hand responds. Whether the fingers tighten slightly when they feel contact, whether the body knows on some level that another person is present, that tells you things no scanner in this palace was built to read. Pulse was fast and irregular. His skin was cold at the fingers and warmer at the palm, told me the circulatory system was in distress, but not in collapse. He was fighting something, and fighting takes energy, and energy means the body is still in the contest. I talked to him. I am aware that this sounds like the least medical thing a person can do. I am aware that the palace physicians behind their containment barrier, watching on their monitors, likely had opinions about it. I do not particularly care about the opinions of people standing behind a barrier while I am sitting beside a patient. I learned this particular indifference early in my career, and I have never found reason to unlearn it. I said his name. I said it plainly. The way you say a name to someone you want to find their way back. I told him where he was. I told him what had happened, as simply as I could. There was an accident. There is something in your shoulder. People are working on it. You are not alone. I told him the date, station, the shift rotation. These are small facts. They are anchors. The brain, when it has gone somewhere the mind cannot follow, often needs something to grab onto to come back. A voice, a name, a piece of known information that the thinking part of the mind can recognize as real. I talked, and I held his hand, and I read his pulse, with my thumb pressed lightly against the inside of his wrist, and I waited. In the 47th minute, the fingers tightened. Not much. Enough. His eyes moved. They found the ceiling first, then the overhead light, then, slowly, my face. They were gray eyes, which I had not known until that moment because I had only ever seen them unfocused. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said my name, because I had been saying it myself throughout. In the way of these conversations, I had said, "This is Sarah. I am right here. You are not alone." And he had heard enough of it to bring it back, I said. There he is. He slept after that. Sleep. Not the other kind. His pulse steadied over the following hour. By the time the royal physicians came back to rerun their instruments, the resonance interference had diminished enough for their scanners to get a partial read. Telvara looked at the readings, then looked at me, and nothing. I think he understood what had happened. I think he found it difficult to categorize. What had happened, in the plain language I prefer, is this. David's body had been overwhelmed by the resonance effect of the fragment and had begun to lock down. A cascade response, the kind that happens when the nervous system cannot identify the threat and defaults to full withdrawal. The cascade was the danger, not the fragment itself. What stopped the cascade was not a pharmaceutical intervention, not an instrument reading, protocol. What stopped was the presence of another person, a voice, a hand on a wrist, 60 years of accumulated human knowledge about the specific sound of another human coming back from somewhere far away. I finished my restocking that evening. I filed the incident notation, patient contact maintained during protocol gap, and I put it in the overnight log the way I put everything in the overnight log, plainly, without ceremony. I was on my second cup of tea the next morning when the door to the break room opened. I will tell you that I have not had many emperors in my break rooms. Sorvan of the Solène Reach was taller than I expected, and his court markings were more elaborate than I had seen in portraits. And he came with only 2 attendants, which I am told is the informal version of a royal visit. He sat down across from me without being invited. I respected that. He told me that David was his attaché, that they had worked together for 11 years, that the physicians had given him very little hope in those first hours, and that, when he had watched the monitoring feed and seen me pull up a stool and take David's hand, he had not known what I was doing, but he had understood, even then, that I was doing something real. He said he wished to offer me a court appointment, senior physician to the imperial household, quarters in the palace, a stipend, the recognition of the Solène Reach. I finished my tea. I told him that I appreciated it, and I meant that. I told him I understood what he was offering, and I understood it was a considerable thing. I told him that David was in good hands now, and that the fragment would be managed, and that the most important part was already done. Then I told him I had a restocking shift at 9, and that the third shelf in the east corridor was still 24 cartridges short, and that someone had to do it. He looked at me for a moment the way people sometimes look at me when I say a true thing they were not expecting to hear. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way people nod when they have run out of a particular argument and know it. I pinned my old medic badge to my collar, the one I have carried since the field years, dented along one edge from a time I would rather not revisit. I said good morning to the Emperor of the Solène Reach. I picked up my crate. The third shelf was not going to restock itself.